Howdy y'all, so today we're going to be going over how to repair broken, cracked, busted, or damaged tubing and to bring it from a piece of scrap tubing into a functional piece of sellable work. So we're not really going to be covering a ton of information today, it's just going to be labor intensive. So here I'm introducing my handle into the flame. I'm going to flare it open so that it's ready to attach to the busted piece of tubing that I have preheating in my kiln. I'm bringing it up to temperature so that when I handle up to it, it doesn't just immediately fall off. I've introduced my first flare and now I'm going to go in with my second flare, making it wider every single time I open it. As you can see, I'm now adjusting it to the size of the tube that I want, and I'm bringing back that shoulder of the flare to make sure that the thickness is going to match to the thickness of the tubing that we're attaching it to. I've purposely busted this tubing in a specific way today to demonstrate the different types of cracks that your tubing can have. This particular color is called sapphire. It is an import color from China, and it is a particularly tricky color at times to work with because it wants to crack for a variety of reasons. So the different types of cracks that we're going to go over today is a surface, internal, and ring seal crack. Now these are all different types of cracks that all do different things and will react differently as we fix them. So here I have my busted piece of tubing. I was indiscriminate and didn't make a particular decision about where or how I was going to attach it to my handle, which is not a good idea, but I just figured, you know what, let's just show you how to do anything and everything today. A better idea would to be not applying heat to the side that has the ring seal crack on it, which will show itself later and I will show you how to repair, but it would have been a much better idea to work on the other side first. Because this tube is quite jagged, I'm taking my glass punty and I'm heating and pulling around the surface of this tubing, evening out the plane that we're working on. Because when I attach my handle, I don't want there to be a unequal distribution of glass, because that's going to cause more issues and more frictions because of the unequal heat distribution that it will cause. It can also just make your handle uneven when you do an initial pull. So here I'm doing what I always do with a handle up to a piece of tubing. I get the actual tubing nice and real dang hot, real movie, real molten, and I just lightly heat the handle and I do a press and a pull, and because there is a ring seal crack on the end of that, I put it into my marver to adjust to make it center, because I was too afraid that if I were to add any jerky motions that it would actually just fall off the handle itself. So I'm having to be particularly careful at this moment while centering this broken piece of tubing onto my handle. So now our tubing is handled up and centered and ready to go. Remember to clean off all of your punties and have anything that you're going to be using to help assist you in this process ready to go at arm's length at a moment's notice, because time is what we're working against. The time between it comes out of the kiln and begins to become cooler as we work with it, because there is going to be an unequal heat distribution even as we work with it in the flame. So here I'm just trying to show you all the cracks, but the flame it doesn't let you see them very well, but that was my thought process behind that shot. So here on the end, what we're working with is a surface crack. These are the easiest ones to fix. They're the ones when you hear a tink and you look in there and you see it's just on the surface. It is such a sigh of relief. It takes 10 seconds to melt those out. So in that spirit of easy breezy beautiful, I'm just going to be heating this tubing up. I'm just going to be turning it. I'm going to be heating the section of that tubing evenly as I allow those cracks to naturally mend themselves quickly and seamlessly without any issue, without any cause for alarm. So now that I've fixed that easy surface crack, I'm now going to go in and I'm going to focus on closing up that tube. I'm going to start taking it from a horizontal to vertical position as I begin to close that tubing down, because I want to work with a closed off piece of tubing, because we're going to be putting on our blow tube to fix this piece of tubing. So here I'm taking my glass punty and I'm pulling together, I'm raking towards the end all the excess glass that we've gathered while closing off that tube and pulling it down to a point so that I have something to handle up to when we attach our blow tube and begin to repair the rest of the tubing. Being completely mindful that there is a ring seal crack towards the handle of that piece of tubing, and if any sudden jerky movement happens, it will separate those two sections and the repair will then become much harder. So I am working very gently, I'm working very softly. My entire goal here is to guide the glass in its natural movement as the heat begins to radiate up and down the tubing. I'm not forcing anything, I'm letting gravity do all of my work for me. Alright, so now we're going to handle up to that point that we've created. I'm heating up my tube and I'm heating up my handle, which is my clear solid punty. I use 6mm personally, that's the one I like. And I'm just going to attach it. I'm going to work it and make sure it's nice and centered. And I'm going to pull out of the flame and make sure it's at an angle that makes my hand comfortable. Put on the marver, add a little bit of a heat break. And then my blow hose got caught on the side of the table, so it jerked it really hard, which was not fabulous. But I just decided to keep moving. So this is going to be our internal crack. So it goes from the surface to the inside, but it's not going anywhere. But it has made it all the way into the interior. And that's important because something that's gone all the way to the interior needs to be mended from the surface to the inside. So what's going to happen is we have to mend the outside and then encourage the mending on the inside by multiple heat sinks. We can't just heat all the way through because with certain types of glass, that's not going to be conducive to the types of minerals that it's made of. So for this first section, I did 2 heats, 2 heat sinks. I mended the surface of the glass and then I moved down towards the next section because I'm going to accurately predict that as I tried to repair the entire exterior of the glass, my handle is going to break off. So not to panic, not to fear, we're just going to allow that heat sink for that middle section to solidify, and then I'm going to take that handle and that separated section and I'm going to match them up as best as I can. Sometimes they'll fit perfectly, sometimes they'll fit just a hair wonky, but just match it up as best as you can. And here I was so lucky it matched up perfectly. And I'm going to go in and I'm going to solidify that surface. I'm going to work that in. I'm going to make it one cohesive happy tube once again. I'm working on that crack in particular, but I'm also putting my hand up a little bit to allow some radiant heat to flush up that tubing because that middle section wasn't fully worked in when that handle came off. So what I'm doing by bringing this tubing back onto the marver is there's going to be 2 small little lips or 2 small little bulges that are going to form when I try to make these 2 pieces one again. And what I'm doing is I'm making them molten, I'm making them hot, and then when I bring them back into the marver at an angle, I'm allowing the natural weight of that tube to press them back into one as a single surface. So on this reheat, I actually gave it a little bit of air. And what I was doing is I was just kind of resetting the wall weight of that tubing. I'm kind of monitoring where the glass has gone when it's separated and when it's been reheated. I'm looking to see where I need to work and how I need to work it. So from my observations, what I've decided to do here is allow the natural gathering of the glass as I do multiple heat sinks to start filling in and correcting any type of visual or structural inconsistencies with the wall weight of this tube. As you guys can see, I'm just going in and I'm packing in that heat from the surface to the interior, and once the interior is nice and moving, it's hot and molten, I'm bringing it out. I'm bringing it back into the marver. I'm adding puffs of air because I'm holding the interior wall out. I don't want it to shrink in. I don't want it to puff it out too much, but I don't want it to start sucking in. I don't want it to start gathering in on itself. I want that heat to find itself on the interior of that tube, and I want that tube to start mending on the inside, but I also don't want it to start puddling or pooling, because geez, is that a whole nother issue. So to avoid that type of overcorrection, slow and steady is going to win the race. Just gradually adding heat, allowing it to sink, bringing it to the marver, puffing out, and reestablish the interior and exterior wall weight. So that pretty much covers how to mend our tubing. I will be showing you how to pop holes out of your tubing if you catch air bubbles, but for the most part, we're completely done on the lesson over how to fix the tubing. Now, there is about 20 minutes-ish left of this video, and a portion of this video is also how to blow out a spoon from the completed piece of tubing. So that's going to be fun to talk about and to show. I just wanted to show you that you can take the finished piece of tubing and then create something with it. I just wanted to demonstrate that. But yeah, for the most part, for a portion of this video, I'm just going to let y'all sit back and watch me just kind of work on this tubing, because it, just takes time. Just slow reheats and then slow gather, slow reheat, slow blowouts. So, I hope you enjoy. Alright, so here's where I'm going to pop those air bubbles out of my tubing. I'm going to put a direct amount of heat onto the tube where that bubble is. I'm literally just going to let that bubble surface, and then I'm just going to allow the heat to expand the air within the glass so it naturally just pops. It's just going to pop all on its own. It'll surface, it'll pop, and the glass will sink back down in. And when it sinks back down in, you want to add a little puff of air. You don't want it to pool, you don't want it to crater, so adding that little puff of air will just allow it to kind of set back into the spot that it already was before you started to heat it up. Also, just in case you're curious, that little head shake was just me grazing my finger against the very hot marver. It was just me going, woo, that's hot. Alright, for the next few minutes, I'm just going to work on evening out the wall weight. So if that's what you're going to see me doing, I'm focusing on some spots and then blowing them out a little bit to make them a little more even. And then I'm going to go back in and reheat entire sections. So yeah, just hope you enjoy. now it's pretty dang even, and it's just about as good as it's gonna get, so might as well make something out of it. So as I'm taking this clear punty off the end of this tube, I'm rolling both hands in opposite directions to create a drag to lift and remove any excess glass from the tip of that tube. And I ended up seeing a couple of little air bubbles, so I went in with some heat, letting them surface, letting them pop, blowing a little bit of air, holding the wall weight, just like before. So the reason I'm reheating this entire section is because I want to make sure everything is happy, it's commingling, it's all the same temperature. I don't want any inconsistencies with the heat of this glass, because what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and start condensing it just a little bit, because I know I'm going to make it the head of a spoon. Alright, so I've got my clear punchy ready, and we're going to pull down a spoon. So this is kind of like the fast and dirty way to make a spoon. This is not the way I would normally teach, but because we're working with a repaired piece of tubing, there's going to be some variations within how you would pull a spoon, because the glass has a memory. It remembers being cracked, it remembers being repaired, and therefore we're going to have to work within the bounds of that memory. So I'm just kind of flying through this process. I'm not like really taking the time to teach somebody the way that I was taught how to make a spoon. So just keep that in mind when you watch this. There are better ways and faster and easier ways to make spoons. So here I'm heating up a section that's going to be the neck of our spoon, rocking it back and forth. I'm watching for that heat because there is slight variations because of the memory of the glass. So I'm having to make sure that when I'm pulling it out, we're not pulling out in chunks. We're not getting weird variations within the glass. We want it to be all nice and smooth. It wants to be a nice, cohesive, easy, slender pull. What I'm looking for is kind of like that valley effect, from two mountains down into a beautiful little valley. Normally you would do one heat and one pull, but because I'm having to work with the memory of that tubing, I'm doing heating adjustments to make sure that everything looks nice and smooth. Not one section pulls faster than the other. All right, I'm doing one last little adjustment on the neck, and then I'm going to move down to my mouthpiece, because the way that I do it is I do pull the neck, I make the mouthpiece, and then I create the head and do the bowl, because that's just how I was taught, and it's just the fastest way for me to make them. And you don't have to make them that way if that's not how it works best for you, but it just works best for me. So I'm just showing you how I do it. So what I'm doing is I am pulling away a section of the color. And the reason that I pull away some of the color as opposed to some of the clear is because I want color from end to end on my pipes. And it may not be your personal preference, but it is mine that my mouthpieces slope. and that the end of my mouthpiece is still the same color as the rest of the piece, or at least the section that it's attached to. But if that's not your style, totally get it. Do whatever you like the best. It's your work, it's your piece. Whatever makes you happy is what's going to suit you best, and it's going to work best for you. So I'm essentially just thinning that out, getting it ready so that when I detach it, all I have to do is a very slight tack and pull to pull the mouthpiece off. So here I'm just adjusting the mouthpiece. I'm just kind of wiggling it around, kind of bringing it down, but then puffing it back out. I want a nice slopey kind of look to it. Now, mind you, there's a ton of ways to do mouthpieces, but this is just the one I'm doing today. It's the one that I made for my production pieces for many years. It's just a fast moving and grooving kind of mouthpiece. But like I said, you can do any type of mouthpiece you want with many types of variations and styles. All right, so now we're gonna make the head of our pipe. So the way that I personally like to do it is I heat up the back end of the portion that we're gonna be blowing out, that tubing, and then I work forward. I introduce where I want the glass to begin to fall, and then I start to gather it back to that place. That's just how I do it. It makes it a little bit easier for me personally, but like I said before, there's so many different ways to do it. But yeah, I'm going to start gathering it back. It's not going to be a solid gather. I'm just kind of allowing it to pull backwards to gather a little bit because I want it to ball up slightly because we're bringing it from a length down to a width. We had a whole other video on this, but what I'm doing is I'm gathering that length back and creating a larger width for my bowl. I like the more mushroomy kind of heads on my pipes. I used to make them almost like light bulbs with these massive kind of domey looking bowls, but this is just my personal preference right now. This is what I like, and so this is how I'm going to make it. But like I said, there's so many ways to make a spoon. So really explore, really enjoy yourself, have a good time, just get wacky with it and see what, is most aesthetically appealing to you personally. So what I'm doing when I'm bringing this pipe vertical is I'm allowing that shoulder to start falling backwards to kind of create that more of a mushroom effect. And then when I bring it back horizontal, I'm taking that kind of that slouchy almost shoulder and then puffing it out into a more round ball. I don't want it to be like super squished, but I do want it to have a very defined shoulder. Normally on a production piece, you can do this in like 2 reheats, but because I said we're working with a piece of tubing that has a bit of memory, I'm going a little bit slower to make sure there's no inconsistency within the wall weight as I blow it out. I'm really looking for it, making sure that nothing is getting out of whack, because a wall with no memory is going to blow up beautifully, easily, and effortlessly. But because we've worked with this glass so much today, I need to make sure and take care of it so that there's no variation within the wall, causing it to become too thin or too thick on either side for any reason. All right, now that the bulb or the head of our pipe is done, we're going to pop a hole for a bowl. The way that I like to pop holes for my pipes is I create a cone shape. I puff out very slowly, very incrementally, tiny little cigar puffs to create almost like a volcano shape coming off of the head of that bulb. And the reason that I'm doing that is because once the hole has been popped and I melt that hole back down into the surface of that bulb, it needs something to step down into to reintegrate back into that surface. If you want to pop a hole really quickly just by adding a bunch of air and pressing that air through the side of that wall and making a hole, what you've done is you've created a lot of thin glass. And that thin glass is naturally going to fall back into the thicker glass. It wants to be warm, it wants to be hot, it wants to commingle. And so because of that, you're going to get these huge, wide, gaping holes as opposed to these tiny little perfect kind of bowl holes that you would need for a pipe. All right, so now I'm going to heat up the face of this bowl, And the way that I've chosen the size of it is by the size of my bowl push and by the amount of glass that I've heated up to then press with my bowl push. So this is a graphite tool, and though I've preheated it to press this bowl, it's still going to be colder than the glass. So it will leave these kind of like little ripples. So what I'm doing is I'm going in and I'm taking those ripples off of the bowl just so it's nice and even and smooth, so it's not hard to clean later on down the road. And what I'm doing is taking my reamer and just kind of making sure that hole is nice and crisp and clean. And now I'm going to bring it into the flame, plugging it with the reamer and then blowing into it and creating a small volcano again, and then popping a hole for the carb. I always reheat and blow the carb hole again twice just to make sure it's nice and thick. And the trick to getting a really nice flat back is I like to heat up the back and make sure that the light is actually shining through the hole of the bowl visually, and then I take it from the mouthpiece at an angle and then set it down onto the marver. That kind of ensures that when the pipe is sitting on a table or on a flat surface that it's not rocking back and forth a bunch. And then I just like to heat up that press and I just kind of let it fall in. And that little divot really does do a lot. It holds that piece onto that table a lot better than if it were just to be like a little flat back. Like that little bit of a lip really does make a difference. All right, let's decorate the piece. What I decided to do is put some dots on here. One of the first things that I was taught decoration-wise was from Darren, also known as Earl Jr. He said, when in doubt, dot it out. And so I just started doing different types of dot patterns early on in my pipe making just to kind of add a little bit of flair and also practice my heating of my thinner rods, my pushing, my pulling, my different types of depositing different size of beads, and that really helps you understand the control of the glass that you're working with. So it's a very handy and useful tool. Also, it's very visually stimulating and pretty to look at. I saw I have a little bit of bubble trash on the end of it, so I'm just taking a rod, spinning it in the opposite direction, pulling it off, and going back into the flame and adding some more dots. I decided I want a thinner dot, so I'm going to take that rod and I'm just going to pull it down a little bit thinner so I get a nice, crisp, tiny little dot. And this is going to happen a couple times just because I'm indecisive and I don't necessarily know a dot pattern before I do it. I just make it as I see fit and I add in smaller or larger dots through the process as I want them. So here again, I'm just going to pull that rod down a little bit thinner so I can get some smaller dots on there and fill in some spaces that I think need a little bit more zhuzh. Something I find very useful when melting in the dots when they've been placed is that I'm not melting them all the way in. I'm just taking away the hard edge around the outside. So as you can see, I'm just kind of lightly flashing around the outside of the dot. I'm not hitting that dot with direct heat. I'm going around the dot. And it's easier to melt in the edges of the larger dots and then go back in and melt in the edges of the smaller dots, because sometimes when the larger dots are next to the smaller dots, by just melting in the larger dot, you also have that radiant heat that melts in the edges of those smaller dots, and it does all that work for you. So you don't even have to worry about it. You just kind of go over it, make sure everything's nice and melted in. You don't want any 90-degree angles. You don't want any hard edges anywhere, because that's going to create friction that could eventually cause a stress crack. Once I get done decorating this pipe, I'm going to put it back in the kiln and I'm going to bring it back up to heat because I want to make sure everything's nice and warm and cozy. So I'm taking my grabbers right here and I'm gonna make a face because, oh my gosh, ouch, I burned myself because I heated up my grabbers to make sure they don't thermally shock the end of that pipe. Subsequently, just not realizing where the heat was in the grabbers and burning myself. So I'm gonna come back down towards the mouthpiece and I'm focusing my heat not on the mouthpiece itself, but on the tube that it's connected to. The idea is that we're going to be continuing the slope of that mouthpiece with the excess or the allowance of color that we had on the opposing end of that mouthpiece. If I were to heat up the already pulled portion of the mouthpiece and continue to pull it, it would just be a sharper and more tight descent. But I like this more kind of elongated almond shape. And then you can decide whatever shape is best for you, but this is just the shape that I currently really enjoy. And what I'm doing here is I'm just tightening up the end of that kind of almond shape. I'm bringing it to a nice point. And then I'm also, at the same time, thinning out the portion of glass that I'm going to push and pull. I'm actually going to do a press and pop now that I'm thinking about it, but it's going to be a press and pop. So that glass on the end of that mouthpiece is super duper thin. Now you could do a press and pull, you could do a poke and pull, whatever you want to do. But when I'm finishing off these pipes, I like to heat up a little section of glass on the end of my rod and then press it onto the cold mouthpiece and then pop it off. It gives it like a nice even break, which creates a nice even hole for your mouthpiece. So we're kind of looking for a perfect porridge temperature. We don't want it to be too hot. It won't break off. Too cold might break off a different section of the glass that we don't want. So just kind of in the middle, wait a couple seconds, tap, and it releases nice and easy. There are going to be some sharp edges left behind, so let's go ahead and flame polish those off. I'm going to take my reamer and we're not going to flare open. We're just kind of reestablishing the hole that was already created, just so it's nice and even and open and soft and easy to use. And that's going to be our pipe. Thank you guys so much for watching the video today. I hope you guys learned something. If you have any questions, just let me know.